Now, another element which is very important when we start debating, you know, who constitutes the threat. Last, well, 2016, there was a historic vote at the United Nations General Assembly on the abolition of nuclear weapons. It was the campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, and that campaign was granted the Nobel Prize just a few weeks ago, okay? And I think it was back in November. Now, the initial vote in the United Nations Security Council was something of the order of more than 120 countries in support of the motion to abolish nuclear weapons, and there's been a follow-up to these motions, and there were 38 countries against. And if you read the Canadian media, you will be totally misled, because they say the nuclear weapons states, the 8 nuclear weapons states, voted against the motion. That's a lie. The DPRK voted in favor of the abolition of nuclear weapons, which indicates something which they decided upon. And it was the only nuclear weapons state that actually said, no, we want the abolition of nuclear weapons. And that doesn't mean necessarily that they will do it unconditionally if the US maintains its 9,000 nuclear weapons, okay? But the lie is that was never mentioned in the media, and neither was the fact that China, Pakistan, and India abstained. So that really what you had was the Western nuclear weapons states plus Israel plus Russia, okay, which voted against the motion. So it wasn't 8, it was the core of the nuclear weapons states. And that, of course, is absolutely fundamental in assessing this, you know, and who's actually the threat. The threat is evidently the United States. And if the broader public had been informed, they would have reacted differently. Now, it's just so happens that the two leaders have funny hairstyles, okay? But maybe that should be the basis upon which dialogue is established. But so now let me go back to Hiroshima briefly. The first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Now, if you go through the diary of President Harry Truman and look at his statements, they're online. His speech that he made on the 9th of August, 1945, the day when the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, he said, "The world will note," I quote, "the world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base, and that was because we wanted to save the lives of innocent civilians," unquote. There was already this notion of collateral damage. But bear in mind that this was a first strike doctrine, okay? It's when I mentioned the repeal of the mutually assured destruction. The Cold War doctrine was repealed, but prior to the Cold War is exactly what we've got today, because the Cold War has been scrapped, and we've returned to the first strike doctrine where the United States essentially uses the bomb against whoever they want. In fact, there are other interesting quotes from Harry Truman, who actually says, God is on our side, and we thank God that we have the bomb and our enemies don't have the bomb, and that we will use the bomb according to his commands. Okay? I have the exact quote somewhere, but it's absolutely diabolical. Now, what I'm trying to say is, you understand that when the lie becomes the truth, there's no moving backwards. So if somebody removes the label from the cigarette pack and then says smoking is good for your health, well, of course, everybody's going to smoke. And I have examined this issue of the label pertaining to the tactical nuclear weapon, because that is the weapon which is envisaged to be used. And they're now saying this is a humanitarian bomb. It just creates destruction. It doesn't kill anybody. Now, propaganda is not only for the broader public. Propaganda is for the decision makers. And it then becomes inscribed in the military manuals. And it becomes, in a sense, inquisitorial, because you can't question it. Say, no, the scientists have said it's harmless to civilians. Well, let's try it out, okay, on North Korea. Nobody will die. Well, even Trump doesn't actually, maybe hasn't read the military manuals, but those tactical nuclear weapons are now back in the Trump Nuclear Posture Review of 2017. What I'm saying, and no, I haven't seen any analysts talking about it, is déjà vu. It was already there during the Bush administration. And now they're pushing this notion that the tactical nuclear weapons are harmless and we can use them, and that in fact they're not strategic weapons at all. They belong to the conventional arsenal. Now, the conventional arsenal is made up of what they call the toolbox. And then the commander in the field, there's a 3-star general, will go into the toolbox and pick whatever weapon he wants. And he is, I've looked at the doctrine behind this, the most efficient, you see, weapon system to reach certain targets. So Kalashnikov, B6111, the B6112 is more sophisticated, and it's going to be financed by this $1.2 trillion nuclear weapons program, which is going to suffocate social programs in the United States of America for the next decade, if they're not already suffocated. So that is the background in which we are. And then the question that we have to start looking into is specifically to North Korea, is what are the solutions to this crisis? The armistice agreement or should I say the signatories of the armistice agreement have not entered into peace negotiations. So the country is still at war. What this means, and I should mention that, is very important. Under the Joint Defense Cooperation Agreement, the US general stationed in South Korea has control over the totality of South Korean armed forces. He is the commander-in-chief. And they formulate it in such a way, they say the president of South Korea is commander-in-chief, but only during peacetime. Now, it's a non sequitur because there hasn't been a peacetime. since 1953. So that de facto, it is the Pentagon general that calls the shots. And when they say they're joint war games, well, they are joint war games in the sense that the South Korean forces are participating, but the South Korean president cannot even veto them under the agreement that they signed. And what I'm saying, I've been to South Korea several times, and this matter has been debated and discussed, and we had sessions on it. The only avenue which in recent developments is in fact unfolding is a North-South peace agreement which virtually annuls the armistice agreement of 1953. In other words, if the North and the South reach an agreement, reach a peace agreement, then the armistice agreement is null and void. But they can only reach that agreement if they repeal what they call the operation control process, which puts all the forces of South Korea in the hands of the United States. There's a nice picture of these guys up there together. You have, there's the joint, you see the president, that's President Park, who has been recently impeached, okay? And then you have you've got the three-star general appointed by the Pentagon, I think is somewhere in the background there. And these are senior officers of the South Korean and US forces celebrating something, I'm not quite sure. So the CFC is the Combined Forces Command, essentially. Now, so that in effect, what we have to achieve is the repeal of this Combined Forces Command, which puts Korean armed forces under the command of a US general. It's a typically colonial relationship. And once it is repealed, then, of course, the North and South can start entering into an actual peaceful arrangement. It would require that there are 27,000 apparently, it's gone down a little bit, troops, at least the most recent data I saw. If these 27.5 thousand troops eventually should be withdrawn, that's not going to be an easy matter. The question is whether it's possible for the South Korean government to repeal its participation in the Combined Forces Command. But that, of course, I think is essential to establishing dialogue between the two Koreas. And that is happening up to a point, because these negotiations a few weeks, no, it was about a week ago on the 9th of January. They've been prepared well in advance. They're not spontaneous. And they were prepared well in advance, and the timing was also prepared. Koreans are people who don't necessarily reveal what they're going to do, particularly in these circumstances. But it's also part of the culture. And it's part of a long-standing struggle against US proxy regimes, going back to the military regimes of the 1970s. But what is contemplated is a repeal of the armistice and a repeal of this Joint Forces Command, and at the same time reunification has been, of course, envisaged for quite a number of years under the so-called sunshine policy. And the question is, how is the US administration going to react to these initiatives? And as we see, the Vancouver group meetings are, I think they're a bit a sign of despair, because they don't even examine any kind of diplomatic agenda which could favor their interests.